test to see if my audio video recording is all okay. In time, I'm hoping to do some programming on this channel, maybe with a little bit of game playing every now and then. And I'll be using a product called Solar 2D. This is most often we program this with a language called Lua. I posted links to both of those on the side, as well as some projects of my own. A little bit of what I'm going to be showing today can be found there, although some of it is only on my computer at the moment. Now I'm going to run through a few projects of mine. Some of these I've been working on lately, some of them are just on hand. What I've been doing most recently is this one, tile texture. And this is in a project where but the trouble is, the way I'm generating it right now involves a dedicated shader for each of the pieces involved. These get very, very slow. So especially on mobile, when I'm say loading it up in Android, it can take a couple minutes just to load this, to generate and then load this texture. And I'm trying to, rather than do this, build up a mesh that contains the same sort of information. It's not a graphical texture exactly. It's, for instance, normals or coordinates that can be fed into another shader. So I'm going for a geometry-based approach where I can pre-calculate everything and then load it later, just directly from a file. So you can see what I've got here. There's this little cap piece. We saw that shape that, roughly speaking, that we have here. And this other thing next to it is a it's based on a Bezier curve, a quadratic Bezier curve. I have an option that will let me break it up a little bit. So we draw this again. There's a gap where I have a line segment extruded along the quadratic Bezier curve, and then two triangles, but curved triangles. But if I remove the separation, they lie flush with one another in this setup I have right here. Above, I've also got, this is just for testing these little points here. They're following another set of Bezier curves, in this case cubics, and that's what I use to generate the shape on the side. If we turn on another option here, we can see what the underlying geometry looks like. And what I've done to do this, to accomplish this, is I have something called an indexed lattice builder, which computes all the indices of these quads. they're triangles but structured as quads, and we'll gather all the neighbor information so that these are essentially a giant column of triangles, and here too. So that keeps them all connected, but it's hard to do that manually. So I made a tool to do so. The meshes have the benefit that we can not only store points, but also they have texture coordinates. And in addition to using those in their standard use to look up a texture, we can also instead encode anything that has a numerical value. And if you look closely at this, you'll see that it's sort of pulsing. And there's a light of sorts that is hitting the surface. This is logically speaking a 3D surface. So it's a cylinder, a Bezier curve cylinder, if you will, with normals. So arrows pointing out of the surface. At the edge here, they're flat with the plane. They're also flat but in the opposite direction over on this side. And in between, they're smoothly rolling from one direction to the other. Although there's a little caveat to that. You can, the way you see it now, this is actually half of an arc. So it's flat over here, but when it gets to this end, it's pointing straight up. And we can change that by setting this to false, and we'll have a full arc. You see how it's just very abrupt where it drops on this side, because the normals are going flat and then they're blending into the triangles. And we want these for different. I guess you didn't even see that. I changed this to dividing by 2. So this demonstrates that we can have different sides of the Bezier curve at different dimensions. And I think I'll be needing that in some ways to combine the results. Definitely getting used to all these hotkeys. Now I'm showing the normal way of the standard way of shading it, which is according to the normals, combined with an effect. And there's nothing particularly special about this effect. What I'm doing with the mesh is I'm trying to generate some very general data. So for instance, we might, rather than this plasticky surface, we might have metal. I've got an instance of that, metal and wood I have in the program that I'm going to be putting this into. I'm also looking at doing glass maybe, or some kind of surface with futuristic looking lighting, I guess you would say. So the shader, there's nothing important about the shader. It's just using the information I'm giving it here. There's normal to UV. That's another way of visualizing this. So as I said, the normals are pointing out here and out here. The values will be between 1 and -1. So we might have x, positive x and negative y here, negative x and positive y here. But in this technique, those are squashed into the range 0, 1. And then we see them show up through the red and green channels, red being x, green being y. There's also not to color. Now here what's happening is that this might benefit from separation again. So the Bezier, we could, if we start here at 0, some sort of parameter value 0, and increase down to 1 at the end, and visualize that as a red channel, you can see that this is increasing all the way down. And the plan with this is to have something different than the normals to affect whatever shader we're using to display. So it's just something that goes up as we go across the curve. The triangles, I've been trying to find good ways of emulating it, because there's nothing necessarily suggestive about the way the geometry is arranged for a great interpolation method, but I've set them all up so that they blend well with these curves, the ways I'm going to use them. And ditto on this cap piece, goes from 0 here to 1 down here, and then interpolates in the in between. I also have these packed versions of the effects. We can show this. And there's, I don't know if it's terribly obvious, but there's a little bit of choppiness at the edges. And that's because it's taking those normals from before and or the knots, and then, well, in this case, just the normals, and compressing them into integers between 0 and 255, and then passing them in as colors. And the idea here is that we can use that to cram a normal really tight. We can encode those two 8-bit values as a 16-bit value into the shader, and only end up using one input to do so, and then pull it back out on the shader side. And then we can use the other component for the knots. So it's a trade-off. It lets us pass in a little more data, but we don't quite get the same fidelity. And ditto, there's pack normal to UV, which is the same sort of thing. It's not terribly obvious either, at least what I see in front of me. But back to this one. All right, and there are a few other things I'm looking at, as opposed to just encoding the normals themselves. Instead, breaking them down into spherical coordinates. So we'd have the theta and phi angles. And what this would do is to avoid where we might have several normals nearby that are roughly pointing in the same direction, but since we're only using one rule to squash them down, we might not get very good range. The different ranges of normals won't be very well represented. whereas if we're using the underlying coordinates, we'll have a fairly linear spread. And also, there's another method that I've come up with that I won't. It's a bit too deep to go into today, but it also allows a different method of compression that might give a few extra bits of information. I'm wanting to have it soon. What I plan to do then is that all these shapes, while they work well enough, they're all isolated shapes. They're not connected, so the meshes are just, even though the vertices are all flush as we see them now, they're not flush and they're not sharing the same model. So for instance, where we see this abrupt edge, it's not interpolating as well as it could because it's just filtering at the edge of the mesh rather than blending across these shapes. So what I still need to do is fill in some parts where, rather than directly computing these borders, we'll compute a few of them, but then for the rest of them, we'll be saying, no, we already know what these values are. We'll be using these indices, so we want to stitch them all together. I got reams and reams of paper with notes on this, but I just need to sit down and do it. I think that's all I'll go into on that one. The other one, I'll just review a few things I've got here out of interest. I have a collision test. This is a little experimental project I have on the side. It's the engine itself is able to use Box2D, and most people do that for collision, and I would recommend that first and foremost. But I'm doing tests in manually performing collision detection just with raw math. So this is all line segments and circles. And so yeah, I'm testing various things, like here I've got step mechanics. So if you approach a low platform, you'll step up onto it. Sometimes I've added, what I want to say, where you can't pass through a platform going up, although it's on a per platform basis, so it's not consistent. Or it's not, I mean, it's consistent enough, but it's not a hard and fast rule for each one. I'm playing with something that I've seen described as Wile E. Coyote physics, where you'll go over the edge a little bit, but you can still jump off of it. You can sort of see it here, but there are also some friction problems on the edge, so it's not working quite as well as I'd like it to. But this one you can pass through. Let's see. I have detection for crossing over multiple edges. It's a little bouncy right now. It's worked better in the past, but fixing one thing breaks another thing. So, there's much reduced friction on this surface. I was playing around with ice mechanics, and the same sort of technique would lend itself to conveyor belts and so on. This will push you on to a step. The pushing isn't ironclad, because you can run and you can get pushed onto slopes. I think this will, if I'm pushing against this as I get pushed on, and oh no, that worked. Okay. Well, it doesn't always work, but this is a bit of a curiosity on its own. What I'm really doing, for instance, here I'm playing with the Gilbert-Johnson-Kierke algorithm, which Box2D uses under the hood to detect when some arbitrary shapes, more arbitrary shapes, I guess I should say. I don't have too many implemented, but what I'm hoping to do is get the 2D version quite robust, the side-scrolling version, and then begin moving it over to something top-down. For instance, like you would see in the E-scans or there are a few Super Nintendo games whose names are escaping me at the moment. Well, Eastern Lagoon, and then there are others, but this is not quite a production level yet. Let's linkage testing. So this is something where you can build nodes and hook them together. And if there's a type belonging to them in common, resolving them to that type. So this is meant in time to become a shader compiler. I'm very, very, very close to having code generation, but I'm not quite there yet. I do also have something akin to what Unreal does, where you have a more sophisticated version of this, but you can stitch all kinds of things together and have multiple things hooked up to one another in loops and everything, where it'll generate code that you can then run. The trouble is this has been cobbled together bits and pieces at a time. It's a giant Frankenstein monster right now. So I began this project as a way to take a second look at a smaller version of that sort of thing, and to test out some of the features that have become really, really gnarled and difficult to unravel. And I'm hoping to feed this back into that earlier stuff and get it into production form. So that might very well be something I'll be covering down the road. And the other things I have here are a few shader tests. I'm big on shaders, so I'll be showing some of these from time to time. I don't think I'll go into any deep analysis of these, but I've got breaking up an object. It was more difficult in the past to do. Some bump mapping. This isn't using a tool, this is just doing it in the shader itself by comparing neighboring pixels. So something like that by using a different dimension. And I don't quite remember what this did, but I thought it looked stone-like, so I thought it was pretty nice. Pseudo 3D with circles and a bump map of sorts. It's a heat shimmer. Someone once asked about the desert levels on the Sonic games, so I played around with this idea. There are some versions that don't omit the pixels in case, for instance, you were in a window and you would never see that part, so you could avoid paying the costs for omitting them. Ice. This is a 2D version of an effect I found long ago in the shader X6, and we initially did something in 3D with this, but I'll try to bring it back to 2D. And it's a difficult one to represent because there's a lot of inputs, and trying to pack it all in is still something I'm not satisfied with. Outline. This is just throwing out around an object. You can go in and color it. This is you can cut out part of an object. There's different ways to do it. This is with a little scrunch at the end. And we can also have a bit of noise on it. let's see, simplex noise. And a few more noise methods. Oh, I also have, this is like that circle technique, but a little more 3D. Some, I forgot what type of noise this is. Might be spot noise, I guess, because that's called spots. Tile noise, fractional Brownian motion. This is good for fire effects. And flow noise. And lastly, Worley noise, which is good for doing, or this is sometimes called cell noise. All right, a couple techniques here. Those are shaders. I have a couple plugins in here as well. So we'll first go through the test 2. Now this is based on a project. I'll post the link here on the side. So the idea is that you can specify a bit of geometry, and the order that you pass the vertices in will be interpreted as a direction. So we can see how these arrows are put together, and depending on the particular rule you specify, the parts that get crossed or whatever's going on with the rule will be omitted or included in the final result. And the reason I made a plugin out of this was that we can often have complicated polygons, but we want to reduce them to triangles. So we can use these to do just that. And there's also one for getting the whatever is considered outside according to those rules. We'll get one or more shapes out of it accordingly. And the second plugin I got here is M squares. This is also based on someone else's project. This is I'll post 2 links for this one. One is a blog post and one's the master project that includes this. And this is based on an algorithm called marching squares, where you can provide a soup of data. So, for instance, a black and white image, or in this case, we'll put a few solid colors. And it'll trace the edges and then create polygons out of them. Here we'll hoist those out and they'll fly around. So this is a set of 4 distinct meshes generated from what we drew. And in a similar way, we'll etch out an object and then throw some balls at it and have them bounce around. And this is doing the same sort of thing, but generating geometry, physics geometry. That's what I have for those. Down the road, probably not too much longer than this, I'll also be trying to cover some C++ side stuff. So the engine itself is now available. It's open source. So I've got a few. Oops. One moment. Hotkeys. I got a few branches where I've been working on some open source projects. I have some of these have been submitted and are now in the engine. I just haven't erased the branches, and some of them are defunct. The state changes is something I'm hoping to make available, certain graphics features that aren't by default included, like the color masks, stencil buffers, maybe depth buffers, some of these things. And I've introduced some things that interact with the display hierarchy. It'll turn those on and off. And the current form they're in has not been accepted. It's just lingering as a pull request. I'll probably at some point withdraw that, scale it back a bit, and then try to move some of the other stuff into a plugin. But it's there. It's something I've got in a more or less functional state. Uniform arrays is another one I got quite well along, probably well enough to include, but I haven't submitted it yet. There's quite a lot more available in the vertex side of our shaders, where we could pass more info in for animation data or large connected geometry. This is how I've used these in the past. I'm hoping to get that in there at some point. Meshes, I've got a few things in there. I have per vertex colors, editing the indices. I'm hoping to add the ability to include subregions of the mesh rather than send the whole thing along every time we've updated. And maybe sharing. I don't know if that would be worth it or not. Where you could have multiple meshes referencing the same core geometry so that they don't balloon up. And Vulkan is on my horizons. I don't know when we'll get to that, but that's an entire other back end. I'm doing lots of research and looking at diving into it at some point. And I've got several, let's see, do I have these recent? I've got several plugins that are also in C++ now. Probably exploring those as well. I think that's about what I wanted to cover. I've been a bit rambling and clumsy, but I think that was a good set of stuff. So down the road, I'm looking next at exploring this project and doing the stitching together of the tile text. For now, I think I'll leave it at that. I hope that was enjoyable, more or less, and I'll see